Hopefully next year we can get
from the Commons Governance Program. It's actually the first program lecture we will have in that Commons Governance Program, which Bill Blomqvist started and I took over in the last academic year. It's also the only program lecture we are running in this academic year, and therefore it's a great opportunity, I think, also to end this academic year with such a great location. So welcome also all of you in the Zoom. Later, if we have time to discuss it a little bit, you can also raise your hand virtually, and then I will get back to you and to you if you have questions. I would like to introduce our speaker today a little bit. So those of you who followed what I have done in the last year, I have always been a bit in a mission to integrate people from the International Association for the Study of the Commons with the workshop. So most of the people I invited over the last year have been ISC members, and that's why I'm particularly proud that today Tine is with us, a former president also of the ISC. Tine de Moor is a historian, which is also a bit a rare species among common scholars. So we are very interested in listening to your talk, and you got your PhD in history from Ghent University. Many of you might know Tine has been placed at the University of Utrecht, where you have been for many years in the Netherlands, and you have been appointed the professorship there of institutions for collective action in historical perspective in 2012. But recently, Tine changed to the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, also in the Netherlands. And now your title of your full professor is Social Enterprises and Institutions for Collective Action at the School of Management in Rotterdam, so quite a move. I know Tine since many years. We are both very committed to the ISC, and we spent many years now working for it and came up with many plans and strategic ideas what to do to raise membership and to make our members happy. So this is really a long engagement, and we went to many ups and downs within the ISC, and particularly also having always challenges, like particularly in the last 2 years, how do you raise personal commitment without personal meetings? So that has been quite an issue. It brings me also directly to your research topic. I mean, how do we make people involved into collective action matters? Likewise, the research themes of what you try to tackle. So Tine conducts research into the creation, functioning, and evolution of cooperative social enterprises, or like I would say the notion you created institutions for collective action that always appears in her talks and publications. As a historian, she studied past and present from the early modern period in Europe until today, and issues that she has been studied and together with her team also in the frame of really 3 big prestigious research grants she brought in. And let me read out a bit here: energy and care cooperatives that have developed over the past, the citizen involvement in short chain food supply, the formation of platform cooperatives, or the renewal of the mutual as a form of insurance for the self-employed. Besides, she has been researching labor market participation and household formation patterns over the past millennium. She has been actively involved in developing innovative research methods, also through citizen science projects, just to name some of the topics you're working on. You might also be familiar with the International Journal of the Commons, so some of you might have read articles or even published there. What you might not know is that Tine is a co-founder of that journal and really started it to get it running. So without further words, we are now interested to hear your talk. And for those in the room, we will have a reception later on where we will offer some food.
Thank you, Insa.
So it's yours.
for a very nice introduction. My history, my relationship, so to speak, with the workshop goes back a bit, I think to 2001, more or less, when I was attending a conference in Chicago and I looked at the map and I saw, oh, Bloomington, that's just around the corner, where this wonderful scholar with her workshop is doing all this wonderful research on commons. And commons was a topic I was looking at as a historian, but barely anyone in my own department actually knew what I was talking about. But there in Bloomington, I had to be. So I came over, Lynn gave me the floor here to give a talk in this very same room. So this is really great to be back. And I've been back in the meanwhile. I'm on one of those wow pictures there, so that's kind of fun. Yeah, it's great to be here again, and great to talk to you about my own work over the past 20 years, more or less, and what I'm doing currently with my team, but also a bit about the relationship with the workshop, with the work by Lynn. So I'm going to take you on a trip, a long journey, quite a journey, I think. So fasten your seatbelts. I think it's important that we're having this journey for a number of reasons. First of all, I think because this journey through time, I call it going back even 1,000 years in history, is important to understand what really makes institutions robust and resilient. You need a long period of time to understand what the effects are of changes in governance of institutions and behavior of their members. And I would also like to challenge you through the talk with a number of questions that I think directly relates to a lot of the research that's taking place here. One of the questions I will be addressing, and maybe also answering a little bit, is whether it is enough to look at a change of the rules to understand what this, of course we do more, but the rules are very important to understand what makes institutions resilient. So let's have a look at it. I would also want to take you on this journey because I think it also will help us to challenge our present day conceptions of, for example, what the meaning is of sanctioning. We all know the role of that in common studies, but if we look at the historical perspective, if we put on these historical glasses, we might see something else. I'll show you later. I also want to do this because if we look at the trends we see over time, if we look at the elements that come back or change, both at the macro level, at societal level, but also at the meso or institutional level, I think we will also see more than just the singular institutions that these commons are, but we see how they are connected or not. To what extent do they belong to a movement? I think that is a very important question, especially today. I'll show you in a moment, but there is a movement of commoners out there. Of course, we all know about this. It has been growing a lot over the past 2 years, at least definitely in Europe, but I think also in the US. And I think knowing about this movement, but also looking at how it grows and develops, tells us a lot about the potential of the individual institution. I'll explain to that later. Now, some disclaimers. I will look mainly at the European situation, and a lot of my data logically maybe come from the Netherlands. We have some data on Spain and UK, etc., but a lot of it will refer to the Netherlands. I'm not saying this is representative for the whole of Europe, but there are very many similarities going on both in history and today. And of course, I am myself representing here my own research, but that could not be done without working together, primarily, of course, with the people within my own research team, a very nice bunch of people working on the topics that Insa just mentioned, from agriculture to energy to mutuals, etc. So yeah, we've been developing this group in Rotterdam, and I see many, I think there's many connections here to what people do here. But of course, the shoulders I'm standing on are, of course, also those of, in particular, Lynn and the people she educated and people around her in the workshop. And I think if you look back at the, let's say, the past 25 years, more or less, so the end of the previous century until today, we've really seen an amazing journey taking place for the concept of the commons. As I just said, I started doing my PhD at the end of the previous century. And back then, I really needed a place like this to find fellow thinkers about commons, because there were a few people who actually knew what I was working on. Right? So since then, I've been getting questions at the school gate, picking up my daughter, people living in my street saying, commons, literally in that term, tell me a little bit more about that? Because I've heard about it, but I don't know what it is. So it really has developed in the direction of a household name, really, right? And it is reflected, this development has been reflected in many different ways in Europe. You see it emerging also in government documents. For example, the city of Amsterdam has a commons plan, literally called like that. Commons plan. You see groups all over Europe emerging to promote the development of the commons. But you also see, of course, it reflected in research. I don't have to tell you about that. You also see it reflected in society by many activists using the concept in many different ways. To stress that, not always the ways I think we as researchers like it to be used. And you see it being used everywhere. Now, as I just said, that commons concept has also been stretched. It has been applied also to many forms of organization. Collaborations between people that you would not really consider as a common from the Ostromian perspective, so to speak. I think we have to consider that term commons a bit more as a part pro toto for a very large variety of institutions for collective action. It has also become a pars pro toto for a lot of other meanings. I think I really would like to concentrate it. I'll say a bit more about that later on, but I look with my historical glasses at the term and I see a historical term that has been lifted to mean much more than that, but I think we have to be careful. What I also see, especially among societal partners, is that Lynn Ostrom's page 90 of her book of 1990, the design principle list that we all know so very well, has become very popular. But I think by becoming popular, it has also been perceived sometimes in the wrong way as a checklist. So we set up a common, we set up an energy cooperative, we take page 90, we check whether we do it right or not. And I think as a scholar, that's really difficult for me because it's the outcome of a comparative process. So there too, I think we have to give some, some reflection about what is the future and what can we do with the newest research we've had in the past few years, what can we do with historical research to put that in a more appropriate perspective. That's a bit the prequel to my journey, so to speak. So now we're really getting started, but I'm starting today, not in the past. If we look at this overview of a few maps of different sectors, you see that a lot of new institutions have been built, in this case across the Netherlands, on your right-hand side across Europe, ranging from new mutuals, new forms of mutual insurance among self-employed in the Netherlands called the bread funds, to provide bread on the table when people are sick, literally, to energy cooperatives all across Europe, in some countries more than others. In Germany, for example, the huge development. And in between, you also see, for example, in the care sector, which has been privatized very rapidly over the past 20 years in the Netherlands, a huge development of citizens providing their own care to each other in the form of care cooperatives, but also in agriculture. People starting setting up as citizens their own local farm, employing farmers and harvesting their own vegetables. It's a big trend, especially in the Netherlands, as other countries as well in Europe, whereby natural persons develop their own institutions. The commoners, so to speak, they often call themselves commoners. There's also a revival among legal persons, so organizations, companies, local governments that set up their own cooperatives, but the bulk of the developments really happens among the natural persons. And it happens in most sectors, but I do think there's a variety across them. I think that will come back several times, where on the left-hand side, you see development of new institutions that are what I would say born out of misery because there's nothing else, because the market alternative is not accessible, payable, good enough, versus born out of opportunity on your right-hand side, for example, in the energy sector, it is possible to get renewable energy through a commercial provider, but these people decide they want to do it themselves because they see an opportunity both technically, but also sometimes financially. It does deliver a revenue if you invest in an energy cooperative. A little bit more about the work that's been done within my team by somebody who's now a brilliant postdoc in Rome on mutual insurance. Is a great development, not just in the Netherlands, but all over the world. We see new forms of mutual insurance arising as a sort of counterforce against commercial insurance. As we know, that is not always functioning optimally. We see different forms. a lot of them digital, but also they go back to the very basic forms of local people. For example, local people, sitting down together, gathering funds, like in rotating saving and saving systems. You see new forms of those roskas, as we call them, popping up, both in countries like the Dutch Caribbean islands. They have new forms being developed right now, but also, for example, in a place like Brussels, at the European capital, where previous people who actually have, for example, a background in Congo, an African background, they set up their new tontines, a new form of mutual. So it is under revival, this new form of mutual microfinance, you could call it. And as I just said earlier on, it's also in the Netherlands very visible. It's a huge development. It's very rapid. And it's a huge development, but in a way also still quite marginal. It developed after 2004, when the insurance for self-employed by the Dutch government was abolished. There was no decent commercial alternative. They're too expensive. So by now, nearly 30,000 people were self-employed in the Netherlands, but important note, there's 1.5 million in self-employed in the Netherlands. 30,000 of those, so that's not even 2%, actually have this membership of a mutual. But because of their existence, the government, new recent government, is actually now reconsidering to reintroduce this insurance that there used to be. So they do have a huge impact, even if they're not that many people. On the digital side, we see the platform cooperatives popping up also there. It's still quite marginal development, but it does have a huge influence on, for example, the presence of companies like Uber or Airbnb in European cities. They're actually being forced out to a large extent because of the way in which they deal with either housing or with social security for their workers, for example. So there we see another development taking place, still quite marginal, still quite young, but still. Now, are these all commons? You could ask your question, yeah? Because a lot of them actually do use the term, oh, we are a common, or in the US, the term we are a commons is often used from European perspective, we'd rather say a common. Or what should we call these institutions, right? What should we call these organizations? Well, let's go back to the gist of it. Let's go back to the very basics and try to sort of look at it from an abstract view. So basically, these are all groups of people, collectivities of members, and both collectivity and members, both those parts are important. They're not singular people, but they do form a group whereby membership is compulsory. So you have to be part of the group, and becoming a member demands something from you. There are conditions that are being set. Now, these people decide that they want a collectivity of resources. That could be anything from physical resources like a piece of land, a car park, a woodland, but also the safety of having mutual insurance, the budget that comes with mutual insurance, or a windmill that provides the energy in an energy cooperative. So a variety of resources that forms a collectivity of resources, whereby it's of course important that it is also managed as a collectivity. Now, as we all know, what you get when you put these two together is a social dilemma. And what do we do to solve the social dilemma? It's creating institutions. I don't think this is a place where I have to explain that. And of course, you have a variety of types of rules that you need to make sure that the interaction between the collectivity of members and of resources is done well. Now, what I'm going to show you here in these three circles is this diagram is actually the basis of how we started developing a new sort of framework to look at institutions for collective action. One that actually also enables us to look at the long-term resilience and the balance between all these elements. I'm going to explain a bit more about how we perceive this, how we call this, and how this can be applied in a historical situation. What is, I think, essential is that if you want to balance members versus resources, you have to look at where the overlaps are between these three factors: members, resources, and institutions. And therefore, the terms on the overlaps are actually very important to understand how our framework, we call this a cicada framework, I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment, how this framework really works. Very important is a starting point at utility. People don't join this institution if there's no utility. You don't join an energy cooperative if you're not getting something out of it. We're talking here about communities of prosumers, so people who are primarily interested in producing energy because they want the energy they produce. But utility is very important as a starting point. To keep the institution going, you also need, however, social equity, so involve people in the decision-making process, and efficiency, making sure your resources are not overused. Yeah, this really, I think, for everyone makes sense. Also, if you would look at the design principle list, these are elements that come back, but it's a bit a different approach. I'll explain to you what's so different from, for example, also the IAD framework. But the gist of it is that this is the sort of framework that should work for institutions for collective action, building also on the evolutionary work that Lynn developed. It's engaging in the talk.
Close to Basie's microphone.
Whatever. That's fine. It's nice to have some background. So I said it's an abstract framework, which allows us to apply it to a great variety of types of institutions, whereby people can have different roles, from owners, consumers, laborers, producers, or a combination of these, right? It can be about different types of resources, from land to labor to knowledge to social security, etc. And it can be about a lot of different, what we call institutional archetypes. And these archetypes are, for us, very important to understand how, within the history of the past 1,000 years, we have seen these institutions for collective action developing. As I'll show you in a moment, there are different archetypes which can be identified. If we look at these, they give us a better insight in what it takes to make these institutions resilient. I will say a bit more about commons, but also cooperatives, etc. So there's different types there. Now, we know that the rules are important. Within our framework, we find it equally important to look also at the size and the heterogeneity of both the group of members and the collectivity of the resources. I think that's really an underestimated topic, especially in a combination of both. If you look at this great variety of institutions, you see that what you have in common in terms of resource really matters. What is a combination of resources you have? If you look at an energy cooperative, for example, there is a lot more technological means to prevent free riding than, for example, in a mutual. Because in a mutual, you need social control, you need a lot of trust as well to make sure people don't call in sick if they are not. In an energy cooperative, if you're a member and you don't pay your bill, you just don't get any energy, even if you're a member. So there's a huge variety there in our, the way in this model can be applied, but it's very important, I think, to look at this variety to see also what it means for people, what it means for these organizations to become resilient. I think all these different types of organizations can learn a lot from each other by looking at these elements. So that's one of the issues we try to deal with. Now, equally, so as I said before, we've developed this sort of framework to look at the long-term development into resilient institutions of these institutions of collective action. We've called it the Decatur Method for two reasons, because it's a nice term. It refers to strategies of institutions for collective action in development, but it's also a bit of a wink towards Bloomington, where we have, of course, the cicadas once in a while. I was working on cicada time, and it was not ideal, but it's for those people who are at the workshop, they know that the cicadas are a nice connection between the cicada model and Bloomington.
That happened last summer. Sorry to interrupt. That happened last summer, so it's fresh on a lot of our
minds. Good. Well, even better, we call it cicada model. Anyhow, now this is very functional, right? It's about utility, about equity, about efficiency. But we want to add another layer. And I think that's a layer that's really not studied enough in the commons community, because it's maybe a bit of a dangerous step. it's the layer of the values that come with these institutions. And it took me a long time myself to actually admit that this is something we need to study, because, well, in this turmoil around the commons, in this huge discussions with a lot of political aspects to it as well in Europe, it's a really hot topic where, you know, people from different sides are discussing from very ideological standpoints. In that discussion, it's sometimes a bit difficult as a scientist to start talking about values. But after a few years, I realized we really have to do this. And then, of course, the question is, what are the values that matter in an organization like this? What if you look both at present day institutions for collective action and the historical ones, are the values that drive this model, that drive utility, efficiency, and equity? And I personally think it comes down to reciprocity, sufficiency, and solidarity. And I'm going to give you a few examples in a moment of the historical application of this. And I'm absolutely convinced, and that's one of the statements I would like to make today, is that it is not enough to look at the rules. We need to understand which values are translated in the rules in order to understand what really makes those rules work. And I have some nice examples, I think, of historical situations whereby these rules really are translated. These values are literally translated in the rules so that people feel encouraged, not from a purely utilitarian perspective, but also from the values they share within the organization. So what is different from, what's the difference of the cicada model with other types of models or methods to study the resilience of institutional collective action? I think there's a number of things. Something that puzzled me as a, as somebody who developed this model for a long time. What's really different? I think it's about a number of things. It's about connecting those key principles like utility to those values, as I just said. I think that's really a vital thing to get a deeper insight in what really are the incentives of commoners, of participants, members, whatever, to keep that organization going. It's also about achieving resilience as a sort of what I would call a tinkering process. On the right-hand side, you see the model developed by Mike Cook on the stages, the life stages of cooperatives. Very interesting work. It's not entirely the same, but in his model, which is more from an economic organizational perspective, he also talks a lot about the tinkering processes. I think we also need to consider if there's not something necessary like rule tinkering, adjusting rules all the time in order to make sure they actually achieve the right level so that they also lead to more better processes within the organizations. I think that when you look, for example, at the RAD framework, there you see more the description of iterative processes, right? And so one follows out of the other. I personally think we need something that captures more this tinkering process. Not entirely there yet how to do that, but I think that's an important element. Yeah, I think I've covered most of this. So those are some elements that I think make it sort of different. Now, as I promised, I'm going to take you a bit back more in time. We've seen the present day perspective. I've given you a sort of abstract insight in how we could look at these institutions. But now I want to put it in a bit of a broader time frame, more context. And as I said in the beginning, I would also like to take a higher perspective, a more macro perspective, a more macro look at these organizations from the movement they form together. It's quite obvious if you look in Europe today, there is a movement going on. But it's not that obvious if you look at the historical development. So I wondered what makes these waves of institutional collective action different one from the other, past from today, and what does it explain? Yeah. So I think taking that sort of more helicopter perspective on the bigger development is something we definitely need to understand what makes these organizations resilient. As I said before, we're talking about a number of different types, archetypes here, historical archetypes in the form, for example, of agricultural commons, usually pasture land, but some of them also had arable land they used together, but also the guilds, which are forms of collaborations between primarily craftsmen in the early modern and medieval period. Shoemaker guilds, for example, or weapon makers guilds, etc. Also waterboards, which are, if you look at the Netherlands, of course, which is, well, wet country, so to speak, very important, but they are incredibly interesting forms of institutions for collective action, whereby collective action was simply vital to keep the country dry. If people did not take care of their own canals, if they were not cleaned, then there would be a problem. Maybe 100 kilometers further downstream, but there would be a problem caused by the lack of collective action somewhere else. So that's a very interesting topic. And I've also added one that maybe you think there's 3 nuns sitting there. They're not really nuns. They're women who were living in smaller communities in cities from the late medieval period onwards. If you go to Western Europe, Netherlands, France, Belgium, we would actually encounter still historical remnants, monuments of these. They're cities within cities of women, and their main form of collective resource they were looking for was safety. Safety because they were working as single women in the city, but that didn't mean they were safe at night. So they created their own cities, so to speak, within cities, and then we call them beguinages. We also see the development of, for example, cooperatives across Europe. I'll put them in a time frame in a moment. Cooperatives starting with agriculture cooperatives, but also financial cooperatives that then later on developed into bigger banks like the Rabobank might ring a bell for some of you. We also see the labor unions as a form of institution for collective action, the mutuals, as I just mentioned, and there's a number of other ones. This is not exhaustive. These are just the ones I've been studying a lot, but there's plenty more. And I'm very happy we have Grant here. Grant has been an intern with our team since the beginning of the academic year, looking at a very, very interesting form of institution collective action, so-called cofradías in Spain and France, understudied, but very relevant also to connect it to a lot of research that has been done on fishing commons within the ISC, for example. And well, we're about to embark on a nice rule analysis of these cofradías in order to compare them to more landed commons, but we don't really have any results here. But there too, you see them developing over time. And why are these institutions, these very old institutions, for example, the agriculture commons, so fascinating to study in the light of resilience? Well, because we see that they have often an enormous track record when it comes down to their resilience, to their longevity. It's very easy to find examples of historical commons that go back nearly 700 years, for example. We have plenty of examples, too many to study, but once we've studied, I'll show you some results about it. And one of the nice things as well that we see these historical references also today popping up again, so it's part of the bigger development. And this is 1,000 years of history in one slide. I think that's quite something. The bottom line shows you the development of those very old archetypes like guilds, commons, waterboards, beguinages, etc. From the year 1000 until the year 1800, more or less 1850, they were developing. I mean, we have data, of course, on how these developed, but the bottom line is that most of them actually disappeared for top-down interference. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, around the beginning of the 18th century. And that's basically taking place all over Europe. But not very long afterwards, we see those other archetypes popping up. In particular, in between the period 1880-1920, we see cooperatives in many different sectors popping up. We see in the banking sector, in the producer, for example, among agricultures, but also consumer cooperatives really develop very rapidly. And a lot of European countries still have Coop supermarkets, and those actually originate in that period of consumers working together to get cheaper prices on their products by setting up their own supermarkets. And the mutual insurances also date from that time, and the labor unions, for example. So there's a real second wave, so to speak, of institutions for collective action towards the end of the 19th century. And today, that development is actually even more diversified in different types. That's the orange wave, so to speak, starting with energy cooperatives developing already towards the end of the previous century. But then you see it also happening in care, in agriculture, social cooperatives to, people working with a distance to the labor market, working together in a cooperative, community cooperatives with neighborhoods setting up their own neighborhood cooperatives, housing cooperatives. I could keep going on. It's really a sort of broad sectoral development. Now, what is really interesting, I think, is when you see these developments, there's really periods that this sort of model was not possible because the government did not allow it. But we can learn a lot from these bigger movements if we look at what drives them originally, what dissolved them in the end, what kind of differences they have, for example, in scaling strategies. If you look at their periods beforehand, before they developed, you see that they often are a sort of reaction to increased commercialization, often linked to increased population growth, and subsequent privatization and market failure. Market failure that often only took place after a while when this movement already started. But it's, for example, very visible in for the first wave, and that started around, the high and late Middle Ages. You see that's a period of great reclamations, they call it, whereby a lot of wasteland was reclaimed. Farmers felt pressured. So they stood up and said, we want to save this piece of wasteland as grazing area for our animals. So we set up these institutions for collective action in order to deal with this increased pressure. Same happens with the guilds in the cities to increase commercialization as a threat to their income, to the quality of the products as well they were providing. This very similar thing happens in the 19th century. Around the middle of the 19th century, you have an economic crisis with a wave of liberalization and a lot of pressure on the population and on the economy, leading to a situation that people take initiative end of 19th century. So if you look at this big movement within the banking sector, whereby farmers get together and create their own banks, and that's the Raiffeisen's development in Europe, which developed into, for example, the Rabobank, which is now a fairly large bank in Europe. That's really originated out of the lack of access to commercial lending. So the farmers decided, okay, we cannot deal with this problem on the market, we will create our own solution. And now, since 2005, and this third wave is really taking off since 2005. If you look at the data, some of the sectors like energy have started a bit earlier, but it really takes off from then onwards. You see that it sort of anticipates the economic crisis of 2008. It's really starting before that time. So it's not a consequence of the crisis. It's more like a sort of, a bird in the coal mine that starts singing because something's coming. I think that's a very important thing to take away from this movement analysis. Now, if you look at the end of these waves, the reasons for the solution are very varied. The first wave really disappears, the guilds, the commons, etc. They disappeared because there's external pressure, which they find impossible to deal with. And I'll show you what that delivers in terms of rules, etc. in a moment. The second wave, thereby the institutions for collective action actually decide themselves to merge. So the institutions don't really dissolve because they don't function anymore, but because they are basically eaten by the larger ones and they become larger and larger. However, what we do see is that the functions some organizations, archetypes had in one wave are transferred to another one. For example, the guilds had an important social security function for their members. That is transferred to the mutual sector. That's something that is often overlooked. People think these are really separate waves, but in fact, there is a connection between them. Now, if we look at the scaling strategies of each of these waves, we see that they're quite different and they teach us something very important about the potential of present day institutions for collective action. There's three different types of scaling strategies we can identify. Each of these waves had a different type of scaling strategy. The first wave, you could call it a split and specialized strategy. It is not the case that there was some sort of central bureau planning, we're going to set up commons all over the place. That was definitely not available in the medieval period. These institutions really developed very locally out of themselves. We even think that the copying of regulation of other commons, for example. This is a picture of how the commons developed in a particular area. You see there's very different centers where the activity starts, probably because of specific economic pressure. But they really don't, it's not coordinated, this development. It's not coordinated in the case of commons. It's not coordinated in the case of guilds. So really, this is an uncoordinated emergence and development of these institutions for collective action. These commoners from one village to the other, they don't talk, they don't have meetings about how are we going to manage this thing. They don't have a union or something. They work on themselves and that's it. Now, the consequence of that is, so it's uncoordinated and split. A specialized strategy is also about keeping an organization small. So once they were becoming too large, for example, guilds, if they became too large, they split up and they specialized their trade on a specific form of a craft. For example, a metal makers guild would split up in a jewelry maker guild and a weapon makers guild. Yeah? So they specialize in order to stay small. That's really a wish clearly from these organizations. But again, as I said, they don't cooperate. Often they're competitors. Now, when there is a top-down legislation in the 19th century is the formation of the nation states in Europe, the period of the formation of the nation states. The nation states want to control. They say, okay, we want to abolish these commons, these guilds. That's omnipresent in Europe in that period. And when you don't work together as an organizations, then you're very vulnerable and then you disappear. And that's exactly what we see happening around the 19th century, early 19th century. You see that this is a graph that shows you the development of commons in that particular area of the Netherlands. You see that most of these commons disappeared around 1850 when there was legislation in 1810, 1860, 1870. So they simply dissolved. And by the end of the 19th century, they were basically, apart from two, maybe all of them was gone, totally gone, extinct. It's a different situation, for example, in the UK, where the enclosures did also make sure that the commons disappeared, but quite a few more survived. But we could call this a sort of mass extinction of the commons in the 19th century. And I think it's closely related to their strategy. Now, the second wave of these institutions is totally different. They merge. So we don't really see the disappearance. They are merging, melting together. Now, the consequence of that is something else. They do survive as an institution for collective action. And this is an example of the Rabobank, so the cooperative bank, whereby in the beginning they had all these separate Rabobanks. And then in the 1970s, they merged, but they still kept these separate units. So they had a sort of reversed pyramid as an organization model. But in 2016, they merged all these smaller units in the big bank. This is exactly the outcome of what happens when you have a merger strategy. You lose your cooperative identity. You lose that social equity. Yeah? So in the end, you're still an organization, but you're no longer that institution for collective action. It's something you see happening in a lot of these larger merged institutions, also in other sectors. It's a constant struggle to make this cooperation work within these larger organizations. Some manage, but some in the end decide to actually dissolve their cooperative identity. Okay, so what is happening today? We have a third wave, maybe. We're at the beginning, it's still small, but maybe it's a third wave. And when we look at what happens today, that's even another strategy, but a very interesting one. So we've learned from the first wave that these organizations want to stay small. From the second wave, we learned that bigger can be better. You actually can survive as an organization and you can even be competitive on the market. Some of these merged cooperatives are doing very well economically seen. If you put these two together, you can do something else. You can also apply a network strategy. And this, in fact, looks very much like polycentricity. What we've seen developing in Europe, and the Netherlands are a very good example of that, is per sector, networks of these organizations whereby they basically support each other. There may be mainly lobby organizations for their particular type of organization, but they lobby very fiercely and often get what they want. And the next aspect to this network strategy is something else. We've also seen, and this is fairly new, max 10 years old, sort of franchise model developing. Because a lot of citizens realize it's a great thing to have this energy cooperative, but it's quite complex to do. So there's some groups that often form first this network organization and decide, you know what, we're going to form a model, and then we're going to distribute this model with some flexibility built in. But for example, in that mutual sector, but also in the agriculture sector, there's organizations that actually not sell, but distribute their model across the country. And a lot of citizens engage and are very happy that some limits are being set or some rules are prepared, etc. But again, that has a risk. Yeah? It has a risk that people don't care anymore about developing the rules themselves, and the distance between the users and the rules are becoming quite large. Now, how effective is a strategy like that? Actually, it can be quite effective. If we look at Germany, we see that a lot of the Energiewende, so the transition to more renewable energy, has been sort of forced by the development of these energy communities or energy cooperatives. I'm not going to say too much about it, but the data actually quite speak for themselves. I want to dig a little bit deeper. I'm getting 5 minutes more from Insta, but I need a little bit more. But because this is actually getting very close to all the work that has been done here, but from a different angle, I think. So I want to plead to go a bit more back to what the content of the rules really tells us. I think we've in the meanwhile developed quite through different stages, from Lin's design principles towards the IAD, and then also the Great IGRI initiative. It's a lot about the form of the rules, what do these rules look like? We've approached it from a different perspective. We've started with the content of the rules and analyzed those in a fairly large project, 2 projects actually. The last one with some other ISC colleagues from Sweden, amongst others, and the Netherlands, whereby we put the rules of 32 cases across 3 countries in Europe together in a huge database and analyzed these in great detail. We really went to the very detail of each rule, coded that in a self-developed coding system. We actually tried to use Lin's system, but it was so big, so complex for us as well, that it was quite far away from what we could find in the historical situation. So we decided to define our own coding system. And I want to show you some results. And basically, the sources we work on are very similar, like the ones from Nepal, the nice code book, the rule books. Well, these are the rule books we work with, a bit harder to read. You need to know paleography. But the good news is that there's tons of these rule books sitting in archives, not being touched by even historians, and they contain magic information for people like us who freak out when they see lists of rules. There's a lot of material there, but it's extremely labor intensive to analyze. But once you do, I think you get some nice results. And this is one of them. So I was saying we need to go back to the content of these rules, because when you do so, you can actually also understand, for example, how the types of rules, and we distinguish different types of rules. And here you see an overview, sort of aggregated overview, rules that have to do with administration, that have to do with resources, and whether it's about a prohibition or permission, etc. So we do follow some of, for example, the ADICO, etc. But we developed our own way of analyzing. And when you put these together, this is an overview of these 32 cases over time, standardized time, and how these developed over time. You see that the Netherlands and the UK, for example, but Spain as well, show what we call a U shape. In the beginning and towards the end, they have a lot of rule activity. In the beginning, because you have to set it up. In the end, because they experience a lot of external pressure and are trying to deal with it. And it's really interesting to see that both the Netherlands and the UK historically have the same development, because those are 2 fundamentally different legal situations, whereby in the UK, there's far less room for the commoners to decide on the rules, but also there, they experience this U shape. So I think that's one thing you can take home from it. And we've actually also put this in an agent-based model done mainly by Amina Gorbani. And interesting there is that if you use environmental shocks nothing happens. If you use social shocks, you also get this U shape. So that really is an indicator that these commoners find it far harder to deal with social shocks, like, for example, new taxation that's been introduced, than to deal with environmental shocks. And in fact, we find proof for this, because if we look at the historical environmental literacy, so to speak, we see that's very high. This is just one example of a case study in the Netherlands. And a text, it's another case study whereby you see how they deal with renewable energy, in this case, peat. People use peat to heat their houses, but of course, peat is not very renewable. It takes hundreds of years, even longer, to renew. So if you keep digging, you're not going to have peat anymore. Now, what you see here is a very interesting development, whereby I'm not able to explain everything of it, but basically, there's this tinkering process going on, whereby they use different levels of fines, that's the purple squares, different levels, to try to avoid that people are taking too many units of peat. And you see also, that's the light green, the number of units of peat per person going down. So you see that they actually have to reduce the appropriation rules, and you can't take too much anymore because we're running out. So they're reducing that, but at the same time are playing with the level of the fine in order to make sure that people also adjust their behavior. We can find quite a few examples of this kind of rule tinkering in order to adjust behavior of the commoners. Now, another example, and this I think is very important for the study of commons, is about sanctioning. Sanctioning is absolutely vital, I think, to understand how these commons function. But what we find on the basis of this historical analysis is that it's actually not that important. In fact, we see an inverse relationship between energy they put in developing sanctions, so whether a rule comes with a sanction, and the longevity of a common. So commons that lived longer apparently had invested less in coming up with rules with sanctions. We find a lot of rules without a sanction. So, but apparently they were managing to survive very long. So we also don't find graduated sanctioning in these long-term historical cases, sometimes towards the end. So apparently graduated sanctioning is rather something you use when nothing else works. It's maybe not so essential as a design principle. What we also see, and I think that relates also to the previous slide, is that when they do use sanctions, it's often when they want to use rules, and often they don't use it for use rules. They do use it for use rules, but not for access and management rules. When they do use it for use rules, it's often to regulate the use of subsoil resources like peat. So they are very much aware that this is where they need it for. Now, interestingly, the UK has a different pattern, and that probably has to do with the lesser influence of commoners on the design of the rules. So there's a lesser capacity to actually regulate your own behavior in the UK. Now, recently there was a very interesting study done by a colleague in Delft, Arthur Feinberg, again, agent-based modeling, and he came to very similar conclusions. Very interesting there too. He discovered among urban gardening examples, quite a few of them in the Netherlands and Germany, that in fact, sanctioning institutions do not always lead to that longer involvement of citizens in these urban commons. And also, he figured that the role of multi-purpose organizations is actually very important, something we also find historical. Now, very quick overview, I'm going to wrap up, yes, but this is important, I think, to link the first part of the abstract cicada model to what we find in the historical data. So I told you it's all about equity, utility, and efficiency, and you achieve that through sufficiency, so, having enough, reciprocity, and solidarity. And actually, these values are represented in the rules that work best within these commons. Because if you don't have sanctions, you do need something else to make sure people behave. And for example, achieving participation in the common was done by promoting social equity and reciprocity through a number of rules, which we can actually also find in a lot of commons research. This is the historical version of it. For example, and the right to vote, but also the obligation to attend meetings, not just have a right, but also the obligation to be there, so that you understand the rationale behind decisions. The electives of representatives, yes, quite normal, but also the rotation of representatives, of roles. And very important, the presence of rules that stimulate liability among commoners. So people who see others free riding can also be punished for not mentioning it to the person who was responsible at that point. So I think these are all elements that really show that social equity and reciprocity were values that were promoted. The similar thing we find about sufficiency, many different rules that had to do with limiting the use of resources in a commercial way, but also linking the use of the resource to the size of, for example, the holding, so that they could actually feed also their cattle in the winter. I'm going to skip these nice citations out of historical sources, but there's plenty of evidence to prove that. So lessons learned, I think 2 broad messages. First of all, I think we need to look more at the movements of these organizations, and looking at archetypes can be a way to identify the different streams, so to speak, in these movements. What we've seen in a historical sense, I think, has to do with archetypes emerging because of an upcoming state market failure. They sort of function as an early warning system. But it's also important, I think, to recognize that these are the predecessors. These commoners are actually preparing our social welfare system that we developed later on. That's something that maybe is often forgotten. And also, if you're, it's quite logic that if your movement is stopped, like we saw in the 19th century, it is impossible for individual organizations to survive. You have a mass extinction because there's exogenous factors that actually push you towards that. But if you can survive, there's a number of other things, and I think values are in that very important, that help you to translate these rules, what we want to achieve as an organization to solve these social dilemmas. And I think it's something we have to look more for in these rules than looking at the actual form. It's in the content of the rules, and it shows, I think, what is important in managing these organizations. Thank you.
Yeah, that was very impressive. Lots of thoughts. I think I would like also to give our audience here via Zoom a chance at least to see us. Yeah. So if we stop sharing, because we can also discuss a little bit with you during the reception, but yeah, the idea of this lecture is that we also have more time to listen to you and limited time to discuss, but nevertheless, I would also give you the floor for some questions, some minutes maybe, that we can start a discussion, which we then continue.
Many hands online, but
yeah, maybe we start here. Yeah.
I have a question about something that struck me at near the beginning, but in your conversation. In terms of, you mentioned that an electricity cooperative might be different than a different type of cooperative, and then you have these 3 different groups, and there's similarities across all these in the different waves. And I'm wondering if we can think about heterogeneity within each wave as related to the reason that the cooperative or the commons was formed to begin with. Because in some ways it seems to me, and that might be a reason for the resilience, because some of them are there because there's no alternative, right? Or because they have a resource that they jointly happen to all be co-located, but some of them are choice. And this goes back to your cicada model. And they're choosing to form that as a reaction to the outside world because they want a different, right, this is your movement. They want a different, they don't want to be in the capitalist society, they want to be in a cooperative. And I'm wondering if the choice to be part of this, embedding your commons in the broader to understand why are they forming this common might influence both their longevity, the reasons why they dissolve, or even what rules they need, because the members are there for different reasons.
Yeah, probably yes. I mean, like energy cooperatives, you see that it's an extremely strong movement in Europe, over Europe. it's probably not surprising in the sense that the utility is anyhow very high for these people. If it's not as prosumer, you get your energy out of it. You know, at the end of the year, you often also get a financial benefit out of it. So the
Social, like, kind of cooperative value out of it
Yeah.
too.
well, the thing is, we're planning, but we didn't get the funding to set up a study on this. Because what we do notice, and it comes out of a lot of interviews with especially founders, like the founders of these restaurants, for example, they clearly indicate that what they do see is that people are engaged in one type of ICA. They often engage also in another one. That might be for different reasons, because they all of a sudden discover, hey, this is another way to do it. It might be because they were sort of biased from the beginning that this is what I want. So we think that there's probably something like a positive spillover effect on pro-social behavior of these people. But we don't know whether this is linked to their initial pro-social behavior, what kind of reservoir it was there in the beginning, or whether the commons actually stimulated this. I would not be surprised if it was a second one. There are some studies that actually show that. But for the present day development, we don't know yet. And for the historical situation, it's going to be very hard to figure out. So yeah, it's a very interesting point, I think. And it also connects these values very closely to their reasons to start.
Tina, I have a question, as it is the Commons Governance lecture. How do you define commons then? I know that it was in your picture as an overarching term, but then later you also had it as an archetype.
For me, I as a
Contrary
historian,
to
I find it
cooperatives and other legal forms, so maybe you could.
as a historian, I prefer to keep it for a historical example. That's also when it was used as such. But I do see the value of using it for the bigger picture. At some point, I've struggled with this a lot as an academic. And at some point, I really went to the subtitle of Lynn's book and I said, okay, I think we really are here talking about institutions for collective action. And that is, I mean, that is for me a more neutral term. And I would consider commons in their historical form as an archetype of these institutions for collective action.
And which archetype? I mean, in contrast to cooperatives and guilds and all the others you had on your 2000
Yes.
slides, what is then particular about the commons as an institution?
Well, I mean, if you really link it to this historical archetype, then it's really about natural resource management in an agricultural setting. The term was definitely used. I mean, it's used in the UK context. If you go to the continent, you have terms like modcon, etc., which are referring to exactly the same type of natural resource management as a commons in the UK, but there are local terms for that. And it's really, yeah, I prefer to use it for that. But it's a pars pro toto now, as we know.
Yeah, I see you. I just want to check if your hands up on the Zoom. Not yet.
Okay, well, actually, I wanted,
Do you want to?
Yeah, but I can.
So we take Jamie first and then.
I wanted to commend you for bringing up this question of, are we broadening our term commons too much? And these are conversations that we've had throughout the year here. At what point does the word term use its sufficiency and efficiency if everything's a commons? But I like the idea of the ICA as the term instead, because then it allows you to have all sorts of different types of governance systems and resources within it. Like some of the ICs that you were talking about made me think, oh, these are more like clubs rather than commons. So I think it gives us a greater diversity. So I'm so excited that your research is pointing this out.
Thank you.
That's
Yeah.
super, that was a comment, so that's saves us some time.
Yeah, always the improvement.
Yeah, so I have lots of questions, but I'm going to restrict myself to offering a hypothesis to explain why increased time and effort on sanctioning does not correlate with longevity.
Okay.
Because increased time and effort on sanctioning is a response to increased non-compliance with the rules. And it's the increased non-compliance with the rules that tends to affect the longevity of the institutional structure. And the sanctioning rules are trying to the new sanctioning rules are trying to play catch up. So if you focusing on the time and effort of the rules to the exclusion of the content of the rules seems to me a little myopic, in that it's the content as well as the time and effort that determines how effective sanctions are in the first place to avoid the situations of non-compliance that arise that lead to more time and effort on sanctions.
I understand your point, but the logical consequence of that, so that's a sort of incremental process, right? You need a sanction because it doesn't work, so you introduce a sanction, but that would imply that sanctions actually, I mean, this sort of incremental process, so it constantly grows. What we do see in the historical context, and that makes it different, I think, is that they constantly adjust. I mean, like the figure I showed you on the peat, they constantly adjust their sanctions. So they also go back to a lower level of fine if things are back in order. They also abolish sanctions if they are no longer needed. So if it would be a sort of process, that we're trying to keep this thing alive, but we have to add a sanction, then you would indeed get to this graduated sanction situation.
Right.
But we see that actually these commoners, farmers, basically were probably cleverer than that. They really came up with this tinkering process is important.
Yeah, and that's really the part of the question. What's the difference between tinkering and iterative processes? Is not tinkering an iterative process?
Yeah, sure. But when I was talking about iterative process, I'm talking more about the methodology to study the commons than actually how the commons functioned. So the rule thinking, the tinkering is something that we identify. I mean, as in the graph again on peat, you see that they actually, to some extent it is an iterative process, but they don't necessarily have to change the whole system because of that.
No, and then that's equally true, for instance, in modern era with regulation, right? We don't enact a brand new Clean Air Act, we enact amendments.
Yeah. I'm looking at the Zoom crowd again. Is there somebody with a question? You can raise your hand. Yeah, Lynn. Unmute yourself, please. You need to unmute yourself.
I forget that part all the time. I have a question about group size, which I don't know if you're collecting data on or if it's something that is somewhere in the background, because when you're looking at the medieval collectives, people generally are going to have face-to-face knowledge of everybody in the group. And when we're talking about larger scale institutions in the 20th century, 21st century, people don't have that face-to-face engagement, but there are probably, my guess is, also small face-to-face groups that keep the machinery running for this collective activity. So my question would be is if you are tracking group size at all, do you find that there is a similarity in group size and interactions over these large periods of time into the present that is somehow part of the woof and warp of what collective institutions are today?
That's a very good question. Yeah. We don't have that much data, for example, on the historical cases I showed you on group size. Unfortunately, it's very hard to track. There's some very interesting work that has been done quite a while ago already by, amongst others, Marco Corsari and Claudio Tagliapietra on the Italian cases, historical cases in the north of Italy. Very interesting because this is exactly the point they're studying, this group size among herding agriculture communities in the Alpine area. And what is interesting there is to see how they did attempt and actually succeeded to a large extent to minimize the group size constantly through new access rules. Yeah. Now, I personally think if we do take this bigger picture of different types of institutions for collective action, and we want to understand what why they vary, for example, in resilience, we need to also include what the resource allows you to be in terms of group size. For example, if you look at an energy cooperative, there's technical means to limit the impact of free riding, right? So social control is actually not that necessary in an energy cooperative. You can do without. So basically, I think the type of resource allows for a much larger group to join without collective action problems, without free riding. Whereas if you look at the smaller ones, and a lot of the current new cooperatives, for example, in the Netherlands, are really like social cooperatives in care, but also in employment and these mutuals, for example, they have this, they are very much aware about the importance of group size. For example, these mutuals, these bread funds are very interesting to look at because they sort of had a natural decision when they started developing this model, which is now a sort of franchising, that they did not want more than 50 members per group. So as soon as a group reaches 50 members, they have to start another one. And that's how it works right now across the Netherlands. And none of these groups has, since its start, become bigger than 50 because they have sort of self-restricted, and none of them has actually dissolved. So the group size, yeah, there are two. If you need social control, like also in the early medieval modern period, group size is, I think, vital, and is something that all these commoners are pretty well aware of.
That's fascinating.
So Brian, you can pose a short question, and then Mike, and then I would like to close the floor. Brian, go ahead.
Good, thank you. Lots of very interesting stuff, and again, really enriches to have the historical depth and so on. I wanted to ask if you might say a little bit more about the role of values that you're looking at. And one aspect is the extent to which those values shift. And just to point to something which may or not be relevant for you, but Robert Putnam, as in Social Capital in Italy, has a book, Upswing, arguing, I think part of it, shift towards more values of what sounds like your solidarity in early 20th century US from a much more individualistic, and suggests something similar might happen now. So again, shifts in the values and how those may affect things. Thank you.
Mike, is your question related?
Yeah, I have a related question on values to where Brian, coming out from a little different direction. Why those three values? Where did those come from? Solidarity is one that had been used before, but why those three, and how are they related to the tinkering? Is the tinkering done in order to restore the values in a way that makes people, or is there a relationship at all?
Right. I think that, I don't think these are the only values, these, that you could trace in basically the regulation people set up. This is not like, I don't think this is something, it didn't develop out of, we think these values are important, but you do see them reflected in the rules. And the reason why these values were identified is because I don't think the rules, the historical rules are actually very smart, and they really integrate certain values. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And they really are different to some extent to the rules that we find today, which don't always, apparently people do less effort now to incorporate these values. They're sort of hidden stimulus for these farmers to basically behave on the common. Well, there are definitely more values that are that can be identified. Why these three? Because I think there is quite a direct relationship between, for example, utility and reciprocity. It's about basically the exchange of resources. Reciprocity is a very vital element in keeping these organizations running. So I think that the most appropriate value there, the most obvious value, so to speak, would be reciprocity. Same for social equity. If you want equity to be achieved, you do need to have a solidarity starting point. Same for efficiency. And that was actually quite a surprise that sufficiency would be the most obvious link. But if you want to achieve people restrict their own appropriation behavior, you have to link it to something in their own household. That's when, you see that in historical rules, it's many times about having sufficient to keep your, having sufficient resource, taking sufficient resource from the commons to keep your farm running. Taking sufficient resource from the common to feed your household. That's something we still see, for example, in community supported agricultural farms today. You can harvest as much as you need to feed your household. So, I mean, the value thing is something that I think we really have to work on. It should be a lot better, true. And we need more methods to actually identify values in rules. But likewise, I mean, one of the studies I would like to do is really a value study among present day commoners, to what extent they actually would feel that these values represent what they want to achieve within their common, their organization. So I think there's a lot to be done still. And as I said, it's something, it took me years to actually admit that we need to add this. But I think there's still a lot of research to be done on incorporating this in the bigger picture on common studies.
Quick follow-up on that.
Very quick.
I like this last direction you're going to, because I do think you need some way to come up with a source of what those values are. And one way of looking at some of these commoner movements that are in existence now, you do a survey of some of those organizations, those might provide the kinds of values that would be particularly important for those individuals, those types of individuals that are forming into that, and then step back and use those values back, plug them into here and see if it sort of connects up. I think it's a great idea to bring the values in. It's a question of how do you do that and which values.
Yeah, and to what extent they are already present. That's exactly what I mentioned earlier. To what extent are these people stepping in the system? Because, that's exactly what their way of living, so to speak.
Super, Tina. Thanks a lot for coming all the way from your program lecture. Thanks to the audience here in the room. We will be rewarded also by reception now, but thanks for the audience in the Zoom room. Thanks for joining us.